There is a place in Scripture called Bethel, a term that means house of God. We first hear of this in Genesis 12 and verse 8, when Abraham first came into the land of promise. He camped between Bethel and Ai, built an altar there, called on the name of the Lord, and after going to the Negev, which is a very southern region, he came back to this same place. It was here where Abraham, due to strife with his herdsmen, offered that Lot could go into the land where he wished. Yet something important happened between the two mentions of Bethel. Abraham did something regretful. He had just really come into the land that God promised, and then there was a severe famine, and Abraham was already in the southern region, so he went down to Egypt. There's no indication that God wanted him to do that. God made a promise, but perhaps that promise seemed to be in question. If this land was going to be threatened by famine, would Abraham trust God? This time, perhaps, maybe not so much. But if we fast forward, we see how Abraham would later reconcile God's promise with what appeared to be that threat of losing that promise. That when God asked Abraham to sacrifice the son of the promise, Abraham did not waver. He knew God would provide, and he did. By then, the promise would not be in doubt in Abraham's mind, even if that meant God raising Isaac from the dead, according to Hebrews, the 11th chapter, 17 through 29. Early on, Abraham went to Egypt to try to reconcile the problem. And going down to Egypt, of course, points to what would later happen to his descendants. Recall that Abraham was going to Egypt. He was concerned what they might do with his wife, a beautiful woman, and so to avert what he thought would be a problem, he told at best a half-truth, did not divulge that they were married. And this caused some problems, of course. It's possible that at this time, as they left Egypt again, that this could have been the time that Hagar went with them, as she was from Egypt, and it resulted in a situation that would later create some problems. Lies, deceit, lack of faith, that seems to be a signal problem in Genesis. People lie, but God is faithful. People are faithless, but God is always faithful, and that occurs over and over. Abraham came back into the land, went back to the spot at Bethel or Luz, where once again he called on the name of the Lord in Genesis 13:4. It was as though he might have lost his way for a brief time, but then came back to the place that reminded him of how important that covenant was. Abraham was by no means perfect, but he came back to the altar, back to Bethel, back to the covenant, back to the promise, and he truly is an example of faith in that. And technically this place wasn't called Bethel just yet, because it had not been so named. But at this point, it would have been known as Luz, and as we'll see, Bethel was the name given by Jacob. Well, how did that happen? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. These are the names that we're familiar with, of course. Isaac was Abraham's son of promise, and Jacob was one of the twins born to Isaac and Rebekah. And through twists of manipulation and deceit, Jacob is going to be the one through whom the seed promise would proceed. Interesting to me that God always used flawed people to bring about his purposes. Isaac was intending to give the firstborn blessing to Esau. Esau had already given up his birthright to Jacob, but now the blessing was in Jacob's sights. And Rebekah loved Jacob more than Esau, and so she counseled Jacob to cook a meal dressed like Esau to trick the blind Isaac into thinking that Jacob was Esau. It worked. But because of the threat of Esau, Jacob was guided to leave the land of promise once again and go back to where Rebekah came from. He did, but on the way, a few things happened. As Jacob was traveling north from Beersheba, he came to a place to rest in Genesis 28, took a stone, laid his head on it, and there he dreamed. In Genesis 28, 12 through 17, behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending upon it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, the God of Jacob and Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring. Your offspring will be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until you have done what I promised you. Jacob awoke from the sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid, and he said, how awesome is this place? There is none other than the house of God, the gate of heaven. In the morning, Jacob took the stone, set it up for a pillar, poured oil on it, and called the name of that place Bethel, which had been at first called Luz. Notice that this is the same general area where Abraham, his grandfather, had made an altar. We don't know whether that altar was still there or what happened to it, but now the place becomes important once again. Jacob made a vow to return back to this place, the house of God. He would serve God. Unfortunately, it would take him a couple of decades before he would return and remember what had happened here. The sun had set, and Jacob had entered his own period of darkness. Jacob went down to the land of Laban, his mother's brother, and there he met the woman he loved, Rachel. And due to deceit from Laban, Jacob first married Leah, Rachel's older sister. Then he married Rachel, and all the while serving Laban. Time passed, and Jacob began having children. It became apparent he'd need to leave and come back to the land. And the Lord told Jacob, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you," in Genesis 31:3. As Jacob relayed his dream to Rachel and Leah, he told them what the Lord said. "I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go out from this land and return to the land of your kindred." Through some difficulty and more deception, they left the home of Laban and went toward Palestine. Jacob knew, however, that he would also have to face Esau again. And as he neared where they would meet, Jacob tried to send gifts ahead to appease Esau. He didn't know how Esau would respond. But before the meeting took place, an even a greater meeting occurred. As Jacob stayed in his camp one night, Genesis 32:24, a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. This was, in fact, a manifestation of God wrestling with Jacob and even allowing Jacob to prevail for a time until he dislocated Jacob's hip and he would have a permanent limp. That this event would be a continual reminder of Jacob struggling with God. Yet this also would be when God changed his name to Israel, striving with God. Just as the sun rose physically, the text would say, so the sun rose spiritually for Jacob. He had left the land and now was coming back home at daybreak. His reunion with Esau went well, and he came to Shechem where he built an altar to the Lord, but it wasn't over yet. God told him, "Arise, go to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." Jacob told his family to put away foreign gods, purify themselves, change their garments. "Let us rise and go to Bethel, that I may make there an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress and has been with me wherever I have gone." God watched over them as they traveled. Jacob arrived, set up a stone pillar, poured out a drink offering of oil on it, and once again called on the place where God had spoken to him at Bethel. The covenant first given to Abraham is renewed, and so is Jacob. Notice the basic connections between Abraham and Jacob here. They both left the land under difficult circumstances, situations in which they both could have displayed greater faith. They were both involved in deceit, which only got them into more trouble. And even so, they were still being blessed. And then when they both came back to the land wherein God would renew the covenant with them, the place to which they came was Bethel, the house of God. And though the unfaithfulness and deceptions of flawed people were there, God was always faithful to his covenant promises. And Bethel stands there as a covenant renewal. It's the house of God, the place where God meets those who return to him. But I want us to see a greater application for God's people now. Let's go back to Genesis 28:12-17, and the vision that Jacob had. Recall that he saw a ladder, and at the top of it ascended into heaven. The Lord stood above it and identified himself as the God of Abraham and Isaac, telling Jacob that the land would be given to him and his descendants. That seed promise, that through his descendants all the families of the earth would be blessed, is also reiterated. God would watch over Jacob and the promise would come about. God would be faithful. That's the importance of promise in Scripture. God is faithful always. Jacob knew this place was special. It was the house of God, the gate of heaven, verse 17 says. And so now we fast forward to Jesus. Who is the fulfillment of the seed promise? Peter identified that fulfillment in Acts 3:24. All the prophets who have spoken from Samuel and those who came after him also proclaim these days, you're the sons of the prophets and the covenant that God made with your fathers, saying to Abraham, and in your offspring all the families of the earth shall be blessed. God, having raised up his servant, sent him to you first to bless you by turning every one of you away from your wickedness. That seed promise is fulfilled in Jesus Christ as he turns people away from their sins. Forgiveness. But there's another connection between Jesus and what happened with Jacob at Bethel. We go to John chapter 1. Jesus came to Galilee, where Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we have found him, of whom Moses and the prophets and also the law and the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Nathanael said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Philip said, come and see. That's John 1:45 through 46. Verse 47 says, they came to Jesus. Jesus told Nathanael that he saw someone in whom there is no deceit. Someone in whom there is no deceit. That's important. I find that statement fascinating because, first of all, it's in direct contrast to what we've been seeing in the stories of Genesis, where deceit plays a major role. But here's one in whom there is no deceit. And Nathanael responded in this in verse 49, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Now keep that in mind. Here's someone in whom there is no deceit, and his response is, you are the King of Israel. Nathanael knew the Lord had come. And I find in here an interesting connection in the book of all places, Zephaniah. Why Zephaniah? Think about Zephaniah chapter 3 and verses 12 and 13. Zephaniah 3, 12 and 13. I leave you in your midst a people humble and lowly. They shall seek refuge in the name of the Lord. Those who are left in Israel, they shall do no injustice and speak no lies, nor shall there be found in their mouth a deceitful tongue. Keep that in mind. Nathanael was one in whom there was no deceit. So there shall be found in their mouth no deceitful tongue, for they shall graze and lie down, and none shall make them afraid. So Nathanael was identified as one with no deceit. Then Nathanael's response connects to Zephaniah 3 and verse 15. The Lord has taken away the judgments against you. He has cleared away your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. What did Nathanael say? Here's one in whom there is no deceit. And he says, you are the King of Israel. Zephaniah 3 prophesies right to this. You shall never again fear evil. Jesus is the divine Son of Man from Daniel 7, 13 and 14. He's the divine King of Israel from Zephaniah 3:15. The prophets pointed to him. But there's more. Back to John 1, 50 and 51, Jesus said, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree. Do you believe? You will see greater things than these. And he said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. How shall we understand John 1:51 about the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man? The only time in Jesus' life on earth where the heavens were said to have been opened were at his baptism in Matthew 3. And after coming up out of the water, the heavens were opened up, and the Spirit of God descended and rested upon him, and the voice called from heaven, this is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. You could also point to the heavens being opened in connection with Jesus when Stephen was about to die and saw Jesus, the Son of Man, standing at the right hand of God in Acts 7, verse 56. But neither of these passages really explain John 1:51, and we find no other event in Jesus' life coinciding with angels of God ascending and descending upon him like that, and we're left with one viable alternative. Jacob's vision in Genesis 28 at Bethel is the key. The key components of Jacob's vision help us see the importance of Jesus' statement in John chapter 1. The ladder reaching from earth to heaven depicts access to God. As the heavens are opened to confer blessings, the ladder is used in both directions. God's messengers both descend and ascend this ladder. God sends his messengers to earth, and his message invites us back to heaven. Yet, God is ever in control. These are his messengers, and he controls the access as well as the blessings. The covenant context of Genesis 28 is significant. God renewed the covenant with Abraham here and with Jacob, and include the critical promise, in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And remember, that's identified in the New Testament as referring to Jesus Christ. The great blessing here is forgiveness of sins. How can we have such a great blessing? We cannot just simply reach up into heaven. Paul points out in Romans 10 that ascending into heaven or descending to the abyss to make salvation happen was not possible for us. But Jesus did just that. He descended, He ascended, and made salvation possible through forgiveness of sins. That God has opened up the heavens by sending Jesus for that very purpose. And by means of Jesus' death on the cross, the shedding of His blood and the resurrection, God opened up the heavens in the greatest of senses. Eternal life opened up to us because He opened up the heavens on our behalf. Why did Jesus use the language of Genesis 28 to describe to Nathanael the greater things? I believe because it shows that Jesus is the ultimate answer to Jacob's vision. He's the fulfillment of the promise. He's the completion of Bethel. He is the house of God among us. He's the true access into heaven itself. He's the ladder that reaches from earth to heaven and the means of God's bestowing the greatest blessings of forgiveness so that fellowship can be restored, that covenant can be renewed, and we can all share in the glory of heaven. Through the death and resurrection of Jesus, God has opened up the heavens in the most profound way and allows us to participate in the promise to Abraham. The blood of the cross has opened up heaven for us. The resurrection has made it possible for us to ascend, to come home to Bethel in the truest of senses. And Jacob's response to the vision is significant because he set up a pillar, called the place Bethel, recognized it as the gate of heaven. And for us, God has set before us Jesus as the cornerstone upon which we are built to be the spiritual house of God. When we look at the cross, and as we partake of the body and blood of the Lord, I want us to see in this the memorial that is the gate of heaven, which God has lovingly opened on our behalf. You know, if you have left the Lord, come back to Bethel, back to the house of God. Come to the house of promise. As we sit this morning and take of the Lord's Supper, let us come to Bethel, come to the house of God, come to the promise, come back to forgiveness, come back to the Lord, because in the Lord's Supper we are coming to Bethel, the gate of heaven, and celebrating the covenant long promised by God. And God be praised for this.